Public sector pay is hitting the headlines at the moment. With inflation running at more than 10%, the amount that public sector workers get paid matters. This affects the doctors, nurses, police force, firefighters, and others who staff our public services. This year, public sector workers were offered a pay rise of around 5% on average. That's less than inflation, but more than was budgeted in last October's spending review, in which budgets for government departments and public services were fixed for 3 years. Last October, inflation was expected to average less than 3% per year over the period covered, and departmental funding was set assuming that public sector pay awards would be around 3%. Inflation and pay awards have turned out higher than that, but departmental budgets remain fixed. In other words, pay awards of 5% this year are more than what was budgeted for. We estimate that this will add around £5 billion to staffing costs this year, as departments have to pay their staff higher wages. But departments have not been provided with any additional funding to compensate. Their budgets have not been adjusted. This will be difficult for departments to absorb without cuts to the public sector workforce. Similar costs and potential cuts to public sector employment will recur next year and the year after. However, even though workers have been offered higher than budgeted pay awards this year, this may not be enough to avoid issues over recruitment and retention in the public sector, or to avoid industrial action. A 5% pay award represents a real terms pay cut of approximately 5% this year, and is slightly lower than expected pay settlements in the private sector. This comparison with the private sector is important because the private sector represents the outside option for public sector workers. Remuneration in the private sector as well as the public sector is therefore crucial in determining whether the public sector can recruit and retain workers. Pay in the public sector has been falling for the last decade relative to the private sector. This chart shows the hourly pay differential between the public and private sector. The differential is positive in all periods, meaning that public sector workers are being paid more on average per hour than private sector workers. However, pay has consistently fallen since 2011, from about 19% to 7% in 2021. As the circle shows, the gap between public and private sector pay is also at its lowest level since at least 1993. But just comparing average pay in the two sectors doesn't capture the full picture. The workforces in the two sectors are very different, with workers in the public sector, on average, more highly educated, more experienced, and older. In order to get a picture of how pay in the two sectors differs for otherwise similar workers, we control for these differences. When we do this, the level of the difference in pay is much lower. The adjusted differential, shown by the green line, was around 0 in 2021 to 2022, implying that public sector workers are paid no more than similar private sector workers in terms of their education, age, and other such characteristics. Lower earners tend to do particularly well in the public sector, whereas higher earners do better in the private sector. This is as a result of what we call the compression of the public sector wage distribution, with fewer people on very low and very high pay compared to the private sector. Women do relatively better in the public sector, whereas men do less well in the public sector. This is largely a result of the fact that women are more likely to work in lower-paid public sector occupations where the public sector pay premium is higher, and the fact that women are more likely to work part-time with less of a part-time penalty in the public sector. There is also significant regional variation in the public pay differential. Public sector workers are better paid than private sector workers in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and less well paid than private sector workers in London, the East of England, and the South East. As well as headline pay, the sectors also differ in the level of workplace pension contributions, and public sector pensions are considerably more generous. More public sector workers participate in a workplace pension, and more are in, typically more generous, defined benefit pensions. This is as opposed to less generous defined contribution pensions, which are more common in the private sector. This is reflected by the fact that almost half of public sector workers receive an employer pension contribution worth more than 20% of their pay, compared to only 2% of private sector workers. When we add pension contributions into our analysis, we can see that, on average, public sector workers are still better paid than their private sector counterparts. In 2021, this difference was around 20%. Even when controlling for workers' different characteristics in the two sectors, shown by the yellow bars, the remuneration differential was 6%, meaning that public sector workers' remuneration was 6% higher than their private sector equivalents. As with the pay differential, though, this remuneration differential has been falling over time and looks considerably less generous than in previous decades. Public sector remuneration has been falling in comparison to the private sector. Headline public sector pay, in particular, is at its lowest level relative to the private sector for at least the last 30 years. It is in this context that the level of public sector pay awards should be considered. A pay award of around 5% for public sector workers, below inflation of around 10% and below what is being offered in the private sector, comes after more than a decade in which pay has already been squeezed. It could trigger widespread strike action and worsen challenges with recruitment and retention. But even pay awards of 5% are stretching the budgets of government departments and will be difficult to afford without top-ups to their budgets. This work is part of the IFS Green Budget, funded by the Nuffield Foundation and produced in partnership with City. You can see more of our work by visiting www.ifs.org.uk/green budget.